Section 7 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 4, Imperial Antiquity, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Constantine the Great, Part 1. A.D. 272 to 337. Christianity enthroned. One of the links in the history of civilization is the reign of Constantine, not unworthily called the Great, since it would be difficult to find a greater than he among the Roman emperors, after Julius Caesar, while his labors were by far more beneficent. A new era began with his illustrious reign, the triumph of Christianity as the established religion of the crumbling empire. Under his enlightened protection the Church, persecuted from the time of Nero and never fashionable or popular, or even powerful as an institution, arose, triumphant, defiant, almost militant, with new passions and interests, ambitious, full of enthusiasm, and with unbounded hope, a great spiritual power, whose authority even princes and nobles were at last unable to withstand. No longer did the Christians live in catacombs and hiding places; no longer did they sing their mournful songs over the bleeding and burning bodies of the saints, but arose in the majesty of a new and irresistible power, temporal as well as spiritual, breathing vengeance on ancient foes, grasping great dignities, seizing the revenues of princes, and proclaiming the sovereignty of their invisible king. In defense of their own doctrines, they became fierce, arrogant, dogmatic, contentious, not with sword in one hand and crucifix in the other, like the warlike popes and bishops of mediaeval Europe, but with intense theological hatreds, and austere contempt of those luxuries and pleasures which had demoralized society. The last great act of Diocletian, one of the ablest and most warlike of the emperors, was an unrelenting and desperate persecution of the Christians, whose religion had been steadily gaining ground for 2 centuries, in spite of martyrdoms and anathemas; and this was so severe and universal that it seemed to be successful. But he had no sooner retired from the government of the world, A.D. 305, than the faith he supposed he had suppressed forever sprung up with new force, and defied any future attempt to crush it. The vitality of the new religion had been preserved in ages of unparalleled vices by 2 things especially, by martyrdom and by austerities; the one a noble attestation of faith in an age of unbelief, and the other a lofty, almost stoical disdain of those pleasures which center in the body. The martyrs cheerfully and heroically endured physical sufferings in the view of the glorious crown of which they were assured in the future world. They lived in the firm conviction of immortality, and that eternal happiness was connected indissolubly with their courage, intrepidity, and patience in bearing testimony to the divine character and mission of him who had shed his blood for the remission of sins. No sufferings were of any account in comparison with those of him who died for them. Filled with transports of love for the divine Redeemer, who rescued them from the despair of paganism, and bound with ties of supreme allegiance to him as the conqueror and savior of the world, they were ready to meet death in any form for his sake. They had become, by professing him as their Lord and Sovereign, soldiers of the cross, ready to endure any sacrifices for his sacred cause. Thus enthusiasm was kindled in a despairing and unbelieving world; and probably the world never saw, in any age, such devotion and zeal for an invisible power. It was animated by the hope of a glorious immortality, of which Christianity alone, of all ancient religions, inspired a firm conviction. In this future existence were victory and blessedness everlasting, not to be had unless one was faithful unto death. This sublime faith, this glorious assurance of future happiness, this devotion to an unseen King, made a strong impression on those who witnessed the physical torments which the sufferers bore with unspeakable triumph. There must be, they thought, something in a religion which could take away the sting of death and rob the grave of its victory. The noble attestation of faith in Jesus did perhaps more than any theological teachings towards the conversion of men to Christianity. And persecution and isolation bound the Christians together in bonds of love and harmony, and kept them from the temptations of life. There was a sort of moral Freemasonry among the despised and neglected followers of Christ, such as has not been seen before or since. They were in the world, but not of the world. They were the precious salt to preserve what was worth preserving in a rapidly dissolving empire. They formed a new power, which would be triumphant amid the universal destruction of old institutions, for the soul would be saved, and Christianity taught that the soul was everything, that nothing could be given in exchange for it. The other influence which seemed to preserve the early Christians from the overwhelming materialism of the times was the asceticism which so early became prevalent. It had not been taught by Jesus, but seemed to arise from the necessities of the times. It was a fierce protest against the luxuries of an enervated age. The passion for dress and ornament, and the indulgence of the appetites and other pleasures which pampered the body, and which were universal, were a hindrance to the enjoyment of that spiritual life which Christianity unfolded. As the soul was immortal and the body was mortal, that which was an impediment to the welfare of what was most precious was early denounced. In order to preserve the soul from the pollution of material pleasures, a strenuous protest was made. Hence that defiance of the pleasures of sense which gave loftiness and independence of character soon became a recognized and cardinal virtue. The Christian stood aloof from the banquets and luxuries which undermined the virtues on which the strength of man is based. The characteristic vices of the pagan world were unchastity and fondness for the pleasures of the table. To these were added the lesser vices of display and ornaments in dress. From these the Christians fled as fatal enemies to a spiritual elevation. I do not believe it was the aesthetic ideas imported from India, such as marked the Brahmins, nor the visionary ideas of the Sufis or the Buddhists, and of other Oriental religionists, which gave the impulse to monastic life and led to the austerities of the Church in the second and third centuries, so much as the practical evils with which every one was conversant, and which were plainly antagonistic to the doctrine that the life is more than meat. The triumph of the mind over the body excited an admiration scarcely less marked than the voluntary sacrifice of life to a sacred cause. Asceticism, repulsive in many of its aspects, and even unnatural and inhuman, drew a cordon around the Christians and separated them from the sensualities of ordinary life. It was a reproof as well as a protest. It attacked Epicureanism in its most vulnerable point. How hardly shall they who have riches enter into the kingdom of God? Hence the voluntary poverty, the giving away of inherited wealth to the poor, the extreme simplicity of living, and even retirement from the habitations of men, which marked the more earnest of the new believers. Hence celibacy, and avoidance of the society of women, all to resist the most dangerous temptation. Hence the vows of poverty and chastity which early entered monastic life, a life favorable to ascetic virtues. These were indeed perverted. Everything good is perverted in this world. Self-expiations, flagellations, sheepskin cloaks, root dinners, repulsive austerities followed. But these grew out of the noble desire to keep unspotted from the world; and unless this desire had been encouraged by the leaders of the Church, the Christian would soon have been contaminated with the vices of paganism, especially such as were fashionable, as is deplorably the case in our modern times, when it is so difficult to draw the line between those who do not and those who do openly profess the Christian faith. It is quite probable that Christianity would not have triumphed over paganism had not Christianity made so strong a protest against those vices and fashions which were peculiar to an Epicurean age and an Epicurean philosophy. It was at this period, when Christianity was a great spiritual power, that Constantine arose. He was born at Naissus in Dacia, A.D. 274, his father being a soldier of fortune, and his mother the daughter of an innkeeper. He was 18 when his father, Constantius, was promoted by the Emperor Diocletian to the dignity of Caesar, a sort of lieutenant emperor, and early distinguished himself in the Egyptian and Persian wars. He was 31 when he joined his father in Britain, whom he succeeded soon after in the imperial dignity. Like Theodosius, he was tall and majestic in manners, gracious, affable, and accessible, like Julius; prudent, cautious, reticent, like Fabius; insensible to the allurements of pleasure, and incredibly active and bold, like Hannibal, Charlemagne, and Napoleon; a politic man, disposed to ally himself with the rising party. The first few years of his reign, which began in A.D. 306, were devoted to the establishment of his power in Britain, where the flower of the Western army was concentrated, foreseeing a desperate contest with the 5 rivals who shared between them the empire which Diocletian had divided; which division, though possibly a necessity in those turbulent times, would yet seem to have been an unwise thing, since it led to civil wars and rivalries, and struggles for supremacy. It is a mistake to divide a great empire, unless mechanism is worn out and a central power is impossible. The tendency of modern civilization is to a union of states, when their language and interests and institutions are identical. Yet Diocletian was wearied and oppressed by the burdens of state, and retired disgusted, dividing the empire into two parts, the Eastern and Western. But there were subdivisions in consequence, and civil wars; and had the policy of Diocletian been continued, the empire might have been subdivided like Charlemagne's, until central power would have been destroyed, as in the Middle Ages. But Constantine aimed at a general union of the East and West once again, partly from the desire of centralization and partly from ambition. The military career of Constantine for about 17 years was directed to the establishment of his power in Britain, to the reunion of the empire, and to the subjugation of his colleagues, a long series of disastrous civil wars. These wars are without poetic interest, in this respect unlike the wars between Caesar and Pompey, and that between Octavius and Antony. The wars of Caesar inaugurated the imperial regime when the empire was young and in full vigor, and when military discipline was carried to perfection. Those of Constantine were in the latter days of the empire, when it was impossible to reanimate it, and all things were tending rapidly to dissolution, an exceedingly gloomy period, when there were neither statesmen nor philosophers nor poets nor men of genius, of historic fame outside the Church. Therefore I shall not dwell on these uninteresting wars, brought about by the ambition of 6 different emperors, all of whom were aiming for undivided sovereignty. There were in the West Maximian, the old colleague of Diocletian, who had resigned with him, but who had reassumed the purple; his son Maxentius, elevated by the Roman Senate and the Praetorian Guard, a dissolute and imbecile young man, who reigned over Italy; and Constantine, who possessed Gaul and Britain. In the East were Galerius, who had married the daughter of Diocletian, and who was a general of considerable ability; Licinius, who had the province of Illyricum; and Maximin, who reigned over Syria and Egypt. The first of these emperors who was disposed of was Maximian, the father of Maxentius, and father-in-law of Constantine. He was regarded as a usurper, and on the capture of Marseilles, he, under pressure of Constantine, committed suicide by strangulation, A.D. 310. Galerius did not long survive, being afflicted with a loathsome disease, the result of intemperance and gluttony, and died in his palace at Nicomedia, in Bithynia, the capital of the Eastern provinces. The next emperor who fell was Maxentius, after a desperate struggle in Italy with Constantine, whose passage over the Alps, and successive victories at Susa, at the foot of Mount Cenis, on the plains of Turin, at Verona, and Saxa Rubra, 9 miles from Rome, from which Maxentius fled, only to perish in the Tiber, reminds us of the campaigns of Hannibal and Napoleon. The triumphal arch which the victor erected at Rome to commemorate his victories still remains as a monument of the decline of art in the 4th century. As a result of the conquest over Maxentius, the Praetorian Guards were finally abolished, which gave a fatal blow to the Senate, and left the capital disarmed and exposed to future insults and dangers. The next emperor who disappeared from the field was Maximin, who had embarked in a civil war with Licinius. He died at Tarsus after an unsuccessful contest, A.D. 313, and there were left only Licinius and Constantine, the former of whom reigned in the East and the latter in the West. Scarcely a year elapsed before these 2 emperors embarked in a bloody contest for the sovereignty of the world. Licinius was beaten, but was allowed the possession of Thrace, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. A hollow reconciliation was made between them, which lasted 8 years, during which Constantine was engaged in the defence of his empire from the hostile attacks of the Goths in Illyricum. He gained great victories over these barbarians, and chased them beyond the Danube. He then turned against Licinius, and the bloody battle of Adrianople, A.D. 323, when 300,000 combatants were engaged, followed by a still more bloody one on the heights of Chrysopolis, A.D. 324, made Constantine supreme master of the empire 37 years after Diocletian had divided his power with Maximian. The great events of his reign as sole emperor, with enormous prestige as a general, second only to that of Julius Caesar, were the foundation of Constantinople and the establishment of Christianity as the religion of the empire. The ancient Byzantium, which Constantine selected as the new capital of his empire, had been no inconsiderable city for nearly 1,000 years, being founded only 97 years after Rome itself. Yet, notwithstanding its magnificent site, equally favorable for commerce and dominion, its advantages were not appreciated until the genius of Constantine selected it as the one place in his vast dominions which combined a central position and capacities for defence against invaders. It was also a healthy locality, being exposed to no malarial poisons, like the Eternal City. It was delightfully situated on the confines of Europe and Asia, between the Euxine and the Mediterranean, on a narrow peninsula washed by the Sea of Marmora and the beautiful harbor called the Golden Horn, inaccessible from Asia except by water, while it could be made impregnable on the west. The narrow waters of the Hellespont and the Bosporus, the natural gates of the city, could be easily defended against hostile fleets both from the Euxine and the Mediterranean, leaving the Propontis, the deep, well harbored body of water lying between the two straits, in modern times called the Sea of Marmora, with an inexhaustible supply of fish, and its shores lined with vineyards and gardens. Doubtless this city is more favored by nature for commerce, for safety, and for dominion, than any other spot on the face of the earth, and we cannot wonder that Russia should cast greedy eyes upon it as one of the centres of its rapidly increasing empire. This beautiful site soon rivaled the old capital of the empire in riches and population, for Constantine promised great privileges to those who would settle in it, and he ransacked and despoiled the cities of Italy, Greece, and Asia Minor of what was most precious in art to make his new capital attractive, and to ornament his new palaces, churches, and theatres. In this Grecian city he surrounded himself with Asiatic pomp and ceremonies. He assumed the titles of Eastern monarchs. His palace was served and guarded with a legion of functionaries that made access to his person difficult. He created a new nobility, and made infinite gradations of rank, perpetuated by the feudal monarchs of Europe. He gave pompous names to his officers, both civil and military, using expressions still in vogue in European courts, like "Your Excellency," "Your Highness," and "Your Majesty," names which the emperors who had reigned at Rome had uniformly disdained. He cut himself loose from all the traditions of the past, especially all relics of republicanism. He divided the civil government of the empire into 13 great dioceses, and these he subdivided into 116 provinces. He separated the civil from the military functions of governors. He installed eunuchs in his palace to wait upon his person and perform menial offices. He made his chamberlain one of the highest officers of state. He guarded his person by bodies of cavalry and infantry. He clothed himself in imposing robes, elaborately arranged his hair, wore costly diadem, ornamented his person with gems and pearls, with collars and bracelets. He lived, in short, more like a Heliogabalus than a Trajan or an Aurelian. All traces of popular liberty were effaced. All dignities and honors and offices emanated from him. The Caesars had been absolute monarchs, but disguised their power. Constantine made an ostentatious display of his. Moreover, he increased the burden of taxation throughout the empire. The last 14 years of his reign was a period of apparent prosperity, but the internal strength of the empire and the character of the emperor sadly degenerated. He became effeminate and committed crimes which sullied his fame. He executed his oldest son on mere suspicion of crime, and on a charge of infidelity even put to death his wife, with whom he had lived for 20 years, and who was the mother of future emperors. But if he had great faults, he also had great virtues. No emperor since Augustus had a more enlightened mind, and no one ever reigned at Rome who, in one important respect, did so much for the cause of civilization. Constantine is most lauded as the friend and promoter of Christianity. It is by his service to the Church that he has won the name of the first Christian emperor. His efforts in behalf of the Church throw into the shade all the glory he won as general and a statesman. The real interest of his reign centres in his Christian legislation, and in those theological controversies in which he interfered. With Constantine began the enthronement of Christianity, and for 1,000 years what is most vital in European history is connected with Christian institutions and doctrines. It was when he was marching against Maxentius that his conversion to Christianity took place, A.D. 312, when he was 38, in the 6th year of his reign. Up till this period he was a zealous pagan, and made magnificent offerings to the gods of his ancestors, and erected splendid temples, especially in honor of Apollo. The turn of his mind was religious, or, as we are taught by modern science to say, superstitious. He believed in omens, dreams, visions, and supernatural influences. Now it was in a very critical period of his campaign against his pagan rival, on the eve of an important battle, as he was approaching Rome for the first time, filled with awe of its greatness and its recollections, that he saw, or fancied he saw, a little after noon, just above the sun which he worshipped, a bright cross, with this inscription: "In tauto nica," in this conquer. And in the following night, when sleep had overtaken him, he dreamed that Christ appeared to him and enjoined him to make a banner in the shape of the celestial sign which he had seen. Such is the legend, unhesitatingly received for centuries, yet which modern critics are not disposed to accept as a miracle, although attested by Eusebius, and confirmed by the Emperor himself on oath. Whether some supernatural sign really appeared or not, or whether some natural phenomenon appeared in the heavens in the form of an illuminated cross, it is not worth while to discuss. We know this, however, that if the greatest religious revolution of antiquity was worthy to be announced by special signs and wonders, it was when a Roman emperor of extraordinary force of character declared his intention to acknowledge and serve the God of the persecuted Christians. The miracle rests on the authority of a single bishop, as sacredly attested by the emperor, in whom he saw no fault; but the fact of the conversion remains as one of the most signal triumphs of Christianity, and the conversion itself was the most noted and important in its results since that of Saul of Tarsus. It may have been from conviction, and it may have been from policy. It may have been merely that he saw, in the vigorous vitality of the Christian principle of devotion to a single person, a healthier force for the unification of his great empire than the disintegrating vices of paganism. But whatever his motive, his action stirred up the enthusiasm of a body of men which gave victory of the Milvian Bridge. All that was vital in the empire was found among the Christians, already a powerful and rising party, that persecution could not put down. Constantine became the head and leader of this party, whose watchword ever since has been "Conquer," until all powers and principalities and institutions are brought under the influence of the gospel. So far as we know, no one has ever doubted the sincerity of Constantine. Whatever were his faults, especially that of gluttony, which he was never able to overcome, he was ever afterwards strict and fervent in his devotions. He employed his evenings in the study of the Scriptures, as Marcus Aurelius meditated on the verities of a spiritual life after the fatigues and dangers of the day. He was not so good a man as was the pious Antoninus, who would, had he been converted to Christianity, have given to it a purer and loftier legislation. It may be doubted whether Aurelius would have made popes of bishops, or would have invested metaphysical distinctions in theology with so great an authority. But the magnificent patronage which Constantine gave to the clergy was followed by greater and more enlightened sovereigns than he, by Theodosius, by Charlemagne, and by Alfred, while the dogmas which were defended by Athanasius with such transcendent ability at the council where the emperor presided in person, formed an anchor to the faith in the long and dreary period when barbarism filled Europe with desolation and fear. End of section 7.